Metabolism is the sum of all the chemical reactions that are occurring inside of a cell or inside of an organism. And usually it's not just one single reaction that is involved in making a product, but a series of reactions that can even like branch off from each other to make a product or multiple different products from an initial starting point. And those series of reactions are called metabolic pathways, and they are involved in either building molecules in cells or breaking down complex molecules in cells. And this diagram right here shows a very simplified metabolic pathway. So it's actually each arrow represents one reaction. So there's 3 total reactions in this metabolic pathway. And the initial reactant binds with enzyme 1, and enzyme 1 then catalyzes the conversion of that reactant into the first intermediate, which then enzyme 2 catalyzes the conversion of the first intermediate into a second intermediate molecule. And then enzyme 3's job is to catalyze the conversion of that second intermediate into the final product. And metabolic pathways are way more complex than that. They could have hundreds to thousands of enzymes involved in a single pathway. And again, those pathways can branch depending on which enzymes are activated or deactivated. It could lead to multiple different results. And even like a certain intermediate could be the final product if enzyme 3, for example, is deactivated. And cells can regulate which enzymes are activated and deactivated to therefore control which products are made at which times in cells. Pretty cool. So metabolic pathways can be divided into 2 pathways. It's either catabolic or anabolic. Catabolic means to break down and release free energy by breaking the covalent bonds in molecules into simpler compounds. Anabolic means consuming that energy and using that energy to build polymers or more complex molecules that are going to have a higher potential energy than the molecules that were used to build it. Yes, catabolic is breaking down. Ultimately, free energy is released, and anabolic is building, and free energy is consumed. The products of anabolic are going to have more potential energy than the reactants, and in catabolic, the reactant had more potential energy than the products, which are going to have less potential energy, and therefore energy is released into the system. So this diagram, make sure you're annotating your notes, writing more than what you are required as I explain this stuff because it's pretty abstract. So this diagram is going to be super helpful in understanding catabolic versus anabolic and why we need to do both. So if an anabolic reaction is taking simpler molecules and bonding them together, there needs to be an energy input. And that's anabolic, and that's going to build this more complex molecule that has higher potential energy. Because energy is never created nor destroyed, it is going to be transferred, and so therefore this free energy is now going to be stored in this molecule. Well, where did that energy come from for this anabolic reaction, to power this anabolic reaction? Well, it actually comes from our catabolic reactions, because in catabolic reactions, we take food molecules that have more potential energy, and we release that potential energy when we break those bonds, and the products are going to have lower potential energy than this initial reactant, and that energy is now going to be available in the system. So therefore, catabolic reactions are going to power anabolic reactions. And so one way of saying it is that in living systems, catabolic reactions are coupled with anabolic reactions. So in order to do protein synthesis inside of cells, that's the bonding together of amino acids to form a polypeptide. Well, first of all, you need amino acids. Where do you get amino acids from? Well, actually from eating other organisms' polypeptides. So when you eat other organisms' proteins, you hydrolyze those proteins into amino acids in digestion reactions. Those amino acids plus the free energy that's released from that hydrolysis reaction, which is catabolic, is going to be used to build your own proteins by reordering those amino acids and bonding them together to create new sequences. And that's based on your genes, the directions that tell your ribosomes which specific amino acids are going to be in the chain in what order. Okay, so moving on. Which of the following reactions is a catabolic metabolic pathway? So look back at your notes before you answer. A, the synthesis of DNA of a DNA strand from free-floating nucleotides using an input of cellular energy, or B, the hydrolysis of DNA into individual nucleotides releasing free energy. So the answer is definitely B, because hydrolysis reactions break bonds, so that is catabolic, and the individual nucleotides are going to have lower potential energy than the reactant, which was DNA, so therefore free energy is going to be available in the system. A represents an anabolic reaction because you need to consume energy in order to build DNA from simpler nucleotides. Energy is the ability to do work, and organisms need energy to survive and function, obviously. We constantly need an input of usable energy in order to fight entropy. So therefore, we're constantly fighting entropy, which is the law of disorder, in order to stay alive, in order to maintain homeostasis. If we have a loss of usable energy input into our cells, into our system, that is going to result in death. So failure of the plant to photosynthesize, and the failure of plants and animals to perform cellular respiration because they don't have sugar available to make ATP is ultimately going to result in death. For different types of energy, we've talked about kinetic a lot, which is the energy of motion. For biology, the one that you need to know is thermal energy, which is a type of kinetic energy, and that's energy associated with the movement of atoms or molecules. And so the more kinetic energy, the more the molecules are moving, the higher the temperature, and therefore the higher the rate of metabolic reactions. And then potential energy for biology, think of it as the electrons shared in covalent bonds in biomolecules like carbohydrates and lipids and amino acids. That represents potential energy when those covalent bonds are broken. And it's more complicated than this, but for biology, just think of it as energy is released. So the law of thermodynamics is what we're going to talk about next. The study, first of all, of energy transformations in matter is called thermodynamics. And the first law, as you know, is energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It can only be transferred or transformed. So the chemical energy in the nut that the squirrel is eating is in the biomolecules that are in that nut, like the fats and proteins. And those fats and proteins will ultimately get transferred to the squirrel when he or she eats it. And then that potential energy can then be transformed into kinetic energy to allow the squirrel to climb up a tree, for example. And ultimately, that energy is going to be converted into heat energy, which will dissipate from the squirrel's body. And that leads me to the second law of thermodynamics, which is the law of entropy. Energy transformation increases the entropy or disorder of the universe. During energy transfers or transformation, some energy is unusable and often lost as heat. So during energy conversions, for example, ATP hydrolysis, what's happening is some of that energy is not going to be transferred efficiently, or I can't say this correctly. Basically, what I just read, some of the energy is unusable and lost as heat. Organisms need to maintain a certain temperature, so they need to lose that heat energy to the environment. And that is going to increase the disorder of the universe. As catabolic reactions happen spontaneously, things tend to naturally break down. And that's why, for example, the universe is continually expanding. It's going from highly ordered to more disordered. Entropy is increasing. And one way to think about life is that it's just a fight against entropy, a fight against disorder. By continually taking in usable forms of energy, organisms ultimately convert it into heat, which is unusable energy released out into the environment. So because of that energy transformation, abiding by the law of entropy, we continually need usable energy to be taken in at all times. And when we don't do that, that's going to result in death. Now, when organisms do die, our biomolecules are going to get decomposed and broken down. So therefore, as we decompose, we are going to be with the law of entropy. We're no longer fighting it, and our bodies will become more and more disordered. And eventually, who knows where all of our various atoms within our body right now will end up over the course of time in our universe. It's actually really cool to just sit down and ponder that for a bit. Where are you going to end up? At least your matter. Because organisms are continually increasing in entropy and converting usable energy into unusable form, I like how I wrote that, they need a constant supply of usable energy in order to maintain homeostasis and grow. Put a star by that sentence. It's a wonderful sentence. Loss of usable energy input means increased disorder. Therefore, cells are out of homeostasis. They're not maintaining order, proper growth. They're not building proteins the way that they're supposed to. Things are starting to get broken down through spontaneous reactions. That is going to result in death. So since the law of thermodynamics apply to the universe as a whole, scientists use a concept called free energy to determine the likelihood of reactions in organisms, or if the reactions are energetically favorable. The free energy change of reactions determines whether or not the reaction occurs spontaneously, meaning no outside input of energy is required. Based on free energy changes, chemical reactions can be classified as exergonic or endergonic. So I'm going to go over both of those. So the first one is exergonic, and beside this, I want you to write catabolic. So any type of catabolic reaction is going to be an exergonic reaction, and these are reactions that release energy. An example is cellular respiration, because cellular respiration is a reaction that is going to convert glucose, which is a more complex, higher potential energy molecule stored in the covalent bonds of C6H12O6, and it's going to convert that high potential energy molecule into carbon dioxide and water molecules, 6 of each. So one large molecule is essentially broken down into smaller molecules, carbon dioxide and water. And so, therefore, the change in free energy is going to be negative, as the reactant had more potential energy than the products. Energy is never created nor destroyed, so if the products have less energy than the reactant, that means that energy is therefore going to be released in that process into the cell, into the system. For endergonic reactions, I want you to write anabolic by that, and its change in G is going to be greater than 0. It's going to be positive, and therefore you're going to need an outside input of energy, or some sort of energy input, in order to perform this reaction. It's going to absorb free energy, and because it absorbs free energy, the reactants that are used to build it, those bonds that are created now have that free energy, and the product that has those bonds now has a higher potential energy than the reactant. So the opposite of cellular respiration in terms of chemical reaction would be photosynthesis. So photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide and water and bonds those molecules together to form one molecule of glucose. Energy is never created nor destroyed. So how does glucose have more free energy, more potential energy than carbon dioxide and water? Well, it's actually energy is transformed from light energy into the bonds of glucose. So the energy to perform this reaction came from light energy that was absorbed by pigments in the cell, and that light energy was then ultimately converted into chemical energy in photosynthesis. And the bonds of glucose is essentially where that light energy now is. So check for understanding. Anabolic reactions require an input of energy and are therefore exergonic and spontaneous, exergonic and non-spontaneous, endergonic and spontaneous, or endergonic and non-spontaneous. So look back at your notes. So anabolic reactions require an input of energy. So therefore they are not going to be spontaneous, and therefore they are going to be endergonic. So endergonic and non-spontaneous. Catabolic reactions are going to be exergonic and spontaneous. So living cells have a constant flow of materials in and out of the membrane. So cells are continually changing, they're dynamic, they're not at equilibrium in all conditions at all times. They are constantly performing three different kinds of work. Mechanical work would be like the cells are literally moving, like the beating of cilia, the movement of chromosomes, contraction of muscle cells. Transport, which we talked about last unit, so any type of active transport requires ATP hydrolysis. And chemical work, which is the anabolic reactions, building molecules such as DNA and proteins and phospholipids and glycogen and cellulose. All those polymers you learned about from Unit 1, to build those requires an input of energy, and therefore cells have to do work in order to build those non-spontaneous reactions. So ATP is a molecule that's defined as like the energy currency of cells on Earth, for living things on Earth. And how ATP works is it stands for adenosine triphosphate, and it's adenine, which is a nitrogen base bonded to ribose. So it's almost looking like a nucleotide, because it's a nucleotide is a sugar bonded to a phosphate bonded to a ribose or deoxyribose sugar bonded to a nitrogen base, except for ATP has 3 phosphates as opposed to just 1 phosphate. So it's almost like a nucleotide. And it is going to power cellular processes. How in the world does it do that? So here's a more detailed picture of what ATP looks like. It is going to couple exergonic reactions to endergonic reactions. And the exergonic process is going to drive the endergonic process. So catabolic reactions, the energy released, is going to fuel endergonic processes like anabolic reactions. So how organisms obtain energy from ATP is by hydrolyzing the third bond in these 3 phosphates. Phosphates are negatively charged, so ATP is actually a highly unstable molecule, and as soon as ATP is built, it doesn't last for very long. And how it can become more stable is by breaking off one of its third phosphates. And so when a third phosphate is broken off, ATP becomes adenosine diphosphate plus an inorganic phosphate. That inorganic phosphate is called inorganic phosphate because it's no longer attached to this biomolecule anymore, so it's on its own. And in cells, what happens, this is by the way, catabolic reaction, so free energy is going to be released as ADP and P have less potential energy than ATP does on its own. And this phosphate that has all these electrons, what happens is it's going to get attached onto a protein or another molecule that needs to get activated in a cell. And when a protein, for example, is phosphorylated, that means it gains a phosphate. The phosphate is going to cause the protein to have a conformational shape change that it didn't have before. And that conformational shape change is going to then allow a particular cellular process to happen. Like, for example, the sodium-potassium pump that we went over last unit. So this diagram shows it. So here is hydrolysis of ATP. So here is the third phosphate right here. You're going to have to add water for hydrolysis to occur. And when you do that, it's going to become adenosine diphosphate plus this inorganic phosphate. This is a catabolic reaction. So there's going to be free energy released and available to do work. So ATP is highly unstable, and as soon as it's made in cells, it's quickly used. I teach my freshmen, think of ATP as like dollar bills. If you have 100 and you get it broken at a bank or whatever, and you have a bunch of smaller bills now, you're much more likely to use single dollar bills than you were to use that $100 bill. So as soon as you break that 100, you're going to spend that cash pretty quickly. So think of ATP as quick, easy, cheap money. You're going to go to the vending machine with it. You're going to go to the convenience store with it. you are going to spend that within the course of a week. So that's ATP. So you're going to run out of ATP in cells really quickly. So therefore, you need to continually regenerate ATP. So if ATP hydrolysis is adenosine triphosphate is broken down to adenosine diphosphate plus a phosphate, how are we going to regenerate it? Well, therefore, we're going to need to bond that third phosphate back together. And remember, phosphates are negatively charged, so there's going to be a lot of energy that's going to be needed to bond that third phosphate back. And where does that energy come from? That energy comes from breaking down food molecules, primarily in cellular respiration. And that is going to supply the free energy needed to regenerate ATP. So breaking down our food regenerates our ATP, and then we'll use those ATP molecules to do cellular work by phosphorylating proteins. Then we just have ADPs. Once those proteins are dephosphorylated, we have ADP and we have P. We need to bond them back together, but we need energy to do that. So we are going to break down the potential energy, food molecules we have stored in our cells, and release that free energy and use that energy to do the anabolic process of regenerating ATP. So how is ATP used to power cellular work? A, it is hydrolyzed into ADP plus P, and P can phosphorylate a molecule to activate it. Sounds good to me. B, it bursts into flames. Or C, it adds a fourth phosphate group to become, what would that be? Adenosine quadraphosphate through dehydration synthesis to energize proteins. Please get this right. So if you haven't been paying attention, what I just taught you is super important. So go back and watch it. And if you have been paying attention, you pick the answer that you know is right. And the answer is definitely A. ATP is hydrolyzed into ADP plus inorganic phosphate, releasing free energy. That phosphate can now phosphorylate proteins, have a conformational shape change, or AKA activate those proteins to do something they couldn't do before. A researcher claims that the synthesis of ATP from ADP and inorganic phosphate is essential to cellular function. Which of the following statements best helps justify the researcher's claim? Take a minute to read those. So the answer is B, because how it works is ATP can be hydrolyzed into ADP plus P, and that can then be used to power a reaction that requires an input of energy, like, for example, protein synthesis. Answer choice D is actually a true statement, but it doesn't explain why ATP is needed for cellular function. It just explains how ATP is built. And then A and C are incorrect statements. So the laws of thermodynamics tells us if a reaction is spontaneous, but it does not describe the rate of the reaction. So just because a reaction is spontaneous, meaning that it doesn't need an outside input of energy for the reaction to occur, a spontaneous reaction can still take weeks to hundreds to even thousands of years. So for example, sucrose is a disaccharide. It's two sugar molecules bonded together. And to perform cellular respiration, you're going to need to hydrolyze that sucrose into monosaccharides first, which can then go into cellular respiration, and then you can perform cellular respiration to make ATP. So you need to continually do this every minute of every day. But sucrose hydrolysis, it's catabolic. Even still that it's spontaneous and catabolic, it would take 1,000 years for sucrose to decompose into monosaccharides on its own, for it to happen spontaneously. So how in the world are cells able to have such a high metabolic rate? How are we able to convert energy so fast, to catabolize things so fast, and build things so fast? The answer is enzymes, and that is going to be what we're talking about in class.